ask consent that further proceedings on the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Tomorrow, our nation's capital will once again host many thousands of Americans gathering peacefully to support the most basic human right, the right to life. For 49 years, the March for Life has united people from diverse backgrounds, different faiths, in all 50 states. They celebrate the dignity of human life and confront the ways our society fails to protect it. This year, the marchers will arrive in a Washington controlled by a Democratic Party that has grown increasingly radical on this issue. Today's Democrats work overtime to keep our country one of just 7 nations on the planet that have abortion on demand, even after the unborn children can feel pain. Our shameful company includes China and North Korea. Fewer than 30% of Americans endorse this view, but Democrats have made it party dogma. On President Biden's watch, Washington Democrats have even turned against the longstanding bipartisan Hyde Amendment. Both parties used to agree that at least federal taxpayers should not be forced to fund abortions. Now Democrats on both sides of Pennsylvania Avenue have declared war on even this. So I warmly welcome the marchers from Kentucky and across the country. This radical version of the Democratic Party needs to hear your voices now more than ever. Today marks exactly 1 year since President Biden became our 46th president. This all-Democratic government has had 365 days to start delivering on some of their core promises. So what were those promises in their own words? Crushing the virus, strengthening our alliances, and above all else, lowering the temperature and reunited a divided country. Now remember, upon taking office, this administration had historic tailwinds at its back. President Biden inherited life-saving vaccines and a distribution system that was already up and running. He inherited a string of bipartisan rescue packages, including one that was only just a few days old. He inherited an economy that was primed for a roaring comeback. Those were the promises. That was the inheritance. So let's take a look at the progress report. Last spring, against expert advice, the Biden administration dumped another mountain of borrowed cash on an already white-hot economy. As a result, we're now being hammered by the worst inflation in 40 years. Practically everything families need and want has gotten much, much more expensive. Constant shortages disrupt family shopping. Households are being hit with soaring heating costs if they stay home, and soaring gas prices if they go out. Our economic trajectory looks shakier today than it did when Democrats were sworn in. Of course, we have continued adding back jobs from COVID lockdowns. That was certainly going to happen. But job creation has massively underperformed Democrats' own projections for job creation with their super costly springtime stimulus package. When 2021 was said and done, the country had added roughly the same number of jobs that we were on track to create before the Democrats implemented one policy or spent one dime. They managed to literally blow $1.9 trillion, but only barely beat the starting trajectory they inherited. They call that spending a COVID package. But less than 10% of the money went to the actual medical fight, and that certainly shows. Americans are entering the 3rd year of this pandemic with too few tests, too few treatments, too many new cases, and too many school closures. Muddled guidance on boosters that caused FDA experts to resign in protest, and needless, divisive vaccine mandates that were not even constitutional. 1 year in, the coronavirus is decidedly uncrushed. And COVID wasn't the only epidemic sweeping American streets. Take violent crime. Far-left rhetoric and anti-law enforcement local policies have led major cities to set all-time records for homicides in 2021. Or take fentanyl. This deadly imported poison was the leading cause of death for Americans aged 18 to 45 last year. The #1 killer of Americans in their prime, fentanyl. So, why aren't Democrats treating this like an emergency? When was the last time President Biden even talked about this? And drug deaths are not the only consequence of our weak borders. Candidate Biden's rhetoric incentivized an historic flood of illegal immigration. And then President Biden's weak policies lit the fuse. The result? The biggest surge in illegal border crossings in 60 years. 60 years. All these issues are priorities for American families. But the Biden administration spent most of 2021 focused on none of those. Washington Democrats spent months chasing a reckless taxing and spending spree packed with far-left policies that citizens never wanted. We spent half of 2021 trying and failing to blow $5 trillion on windmills and welfare. When that effort faded, Democrats abruptly pivoted and started shouting that American democracy was on death's door. They propagandized that some evil anti-voting conspiracy is sweeping America. And the only solution to this grand crisis was a gigantic partisan election takeover bill that Democrats had conveniently written years before the events which they say now prompted it. The American people didn't buy the fake hysteria. 0.5% of the country thinks election laws are a top issue. In fact, more Americans believe voting laws are actually too loose than too tight. Oh, but Democrats went all in on this obsession. A few days ago, the sitting President of the United States called millions of Americans his domestic enemies and analyzed United States senators to Jefferson Davis. Well, last night the fake panic drove 48 Senate Democrats to walk the plank on a failed effort to shatter the Senate itself for short-term power. And now Washington Democrats appear to be launching an absurd and reckless campaign to delegitimize the next election in advance in case they lose it. Sound familiar? Yesterday, the president told reporters that he might not accept the 2022 election results as legitimate if his election takeover bills do not pass Congress first. All sounds eerily familiar. This morning, the House Majority Whip followed suit. He was asked if the legitimacy of our elections is contingent on Washington Democrats passing these bills, and he replied, "I'm absolutely concerned about that." The Democrats, who preached countless sermons about accepting voters' decisions, are now saying the midterms may be illegitimate unless they win. So, America, after all of this, do you feel unified? Do you feel healed? Do you feel like our core institutions are being protected? Now, Senate Republicans have met this administration more than halfway. In 2021, the Senate built and passed a major infrastructure deal We passed bipartisan legislation on competing with China. But beyond that, this administration deliberately chose to build their whole governing strategy around the party line reconciliation process. So the president cannot deflect blame for his disappointing first year. The American people know where the buck stops, and if our Democratic friends do not change course before long, the buck will stop somewhere else. Now, on a related matter, President Biden also campaigned on strengthening America's partnerships and renewing our global leadership. Well, how's the administration done? The administration that campaigned on restoring alliances abandoned a coalition of loyal partners with its disastrous and fatal retreat from Afghanistan. The Biden administration greenlit Vladimir Putin's Nord Stream 2 pipeline, and the Senate Democrats blocked us from sanctioning it. This pipeline will help Putin gain even more leverage over Western Europe and, of course, further isolate Ukraine. As we speak, right now, Putin has amassed more than 100,000 Russian troops along the border of Ukraine. If these forces cross into Ukraine, it will not be a new invasion or a reinvasion. It will represent a major escalation of an ongoing occupation. Ukraine's been fighting a Russian-backed war on its own now for 8 years. 8 years ago, I tried to warn President Obama that Putin is only deterred when the world imposes real costs on his misbehavior. But the Biden administration sent Ukraine non-lethal support, and the sanctions it imposed and coordinated proved not to be as tough as advertised. The Obama-Biden administration failed to end Putin's invasion or compel compliance with the Minsk Accords. Now, the Biden-Harris team must not repeat the Obama-Biden team's grave mistakes. But yesterday, on live television, President Biden telegraphed passivity and weakness, exactly when our allies can least afford it. Our president seemed to state, and I pray unintentionally, that he expects Putin to escalate in Ukraine, and in any case, Putin can do what he wants. Here's what the president said. That decision is totally, solely, completely a Putin decision. I suspect it matters which side of the bed he gets up on. What on earth does that mean? Further, the president said, my guess is he will move in. The president said, my guess is he'll move in. He has to do something. So President Biden thinks Putin has to do something? What does that even mean? Why is our president speculating like a passive observer on the sidelines? He isn't a pundit. He isn't Putin's psychoanalyst. He's the President of the United States. So will America hold Russia accountable if it escalates? Here was the message from our commander-in-chief, quote, it depends on what Russia does. It's one thing if it's a minor incursion, and then we end up having to fight about what to do and not do, etc. It's one thing if it's a minor incursion. Does this mean President Biden will not actually authorize the tough response that his own administration officials have spent weeks promising? This was a moment to deliver a powerful warning to the Kremlin that Ukraine's sovereignty is inviolable, that we would stand with her people, that the cost of escalation would be devastating. It was a moment to reassure our partners in Kiev and our allies along NATO's eastern flank that America had their back. It was a moment to call for NATO's unity, not to expose and appear hamstrung by NATO's divisions. It was a bizarre and devastating performance, especially, I would add, for our friends on the front lines. President Zelensky's defense minister has already shot back, quote, this is from Ukraine's defense minister, "We should not give Putin the slightest chance to play with quasi-aggression or small incursion operations. This aggression was already there since 2014. This is the fact." I suspect our own Secretary of State, who's in Europe to meet with our allies and Russian foreign minister, was also shocked by what the president had to say. Minutes later, White House staff put out a frantic statement laying out a completely different position than what President Biden had just expressed. By then, of course, significant damage had been done. But alas, the damage can be undone. The President of the United States is never powerless. President Biden needs to clean up his remarks. He needs to clearly state American resolve and clearly demonstrate American leadership. He should call President Zelensky and NATO's allies most threatened by Russian aggression. He should rally allies and partners around the world to defend Ukraine and the international system that is being threatened by Putin. His administration should be using every waking moment right now, to expedite our delivery of real defensive capabilities to Ukraine. The President must cut the indecision and red tape that has slowed us and our partners down. President Biden should finally, at long last, get around to nominating an ambassador to Ukraine, a position that he's left empty for 12 crucial months. He should send U.S. forces to shore up NATO's eastern flank, not if and when Putin escalates, but right now, before it's too late. He should encourage our treaty allies to do likewise. But while alliance unity is important, the lowest common denominator of NATO's most nervous members cannot be allowed to restrict American action. Whatever course other nations choose to chart, we cannot afford to let Moscow underestimate our resolve to impose serious, crushing costs in response to any further incursion against Ukraine. Our friends and America's reputation deserve nothing less.